Hi, guys. So today we're going to be doing two things. First, we're going to be reviewing some basic story elements that we learned about last year in the seventh grade. And then we're going to be talking about how to annotate a text and by identifying these story elements as we encounter them in our short stories. So let's start with some of the review items. We're going to be going over plot, protagonist, conflict, setting, characterization, conflict, all of these basic story elements we learned about last year. So let's start with plot. Plot is the literary element that describes the structure of a story. Okay, so what happens in a story? That is the plot. Our protagonist. This is another term for the main character of the story. The protagonist is at the center of the plot. They make the key decisions and experience the consequences of those decisions. So our main character is going to be our protagonist. Now, if we think in terms of characters in a story, our antagonist is going to be the person who opposes the protagonist. So if we're thinking Harry Potter's the protagonist, he's the main character. The antagonist would then be Voldemort. He's the one who opposes Harry Potter and provides a lot of the conflict in the story. All right, setting. We know that to accurately describe the setting, we have to say what the time and the place of the story is. So when we read Incantation last year, the setting was the 16th century in Spain. That was the setting. Conflict. We know that conflict is the dramatic struggle between two forces. This is what makes the story interesting and makes the story worth reading. Let's look at the different types of conflict together. So we have 5 main types of conflict. We have character versus character. This is the type of conflict where characters struggle against one another. Okay, so this could be a verbal altercation, it could be a physical altercation, but it's between two specific characters. We have character versus self. This is the type of conflict where there is an internal struggle, when one character is fighting with themselves, trying to make a decision, trying to choose between various options. Okay, so our example here is a student struggling to decide whether they should go to a birthday party or study for a test. That would be a character versus self conflict because it is a decision occurring within the character. We have character versus society. This is the type of conflict where a character is alone or in the minority and fighting against the majority over a large issue like race or religion. So last year when we read Incantation, Estrella was involved in a character versus society conflict because she was being persecuted for being Jewish, right? She's a part of this larger issue like religion, and her being persecuted for her religion would be a character versus society conflict. All right, our last 2, we have character versus nature. This is the type of conflict where the characters face problems that occur due to their environment. Okay, so being stranded on a deserted island, in a long walk to water, having to cross a dangerous river, or being stuck in the desert without any water, or being on a long journey without any food. These are all character versus nature conflicts. And lastly, we have character versus technology. This is the type of conflict where the character is usually faced with a battle against machines that have become too powerful. Okay, so if we're thinking movies, Neo battling the machines in The Matrix, that is a character versus technology conflict. Last year when we read The Veldt by Ray Bradbury and The Children's Playroom, murdered their parents. That is a character versus technology conflict. The technology became too smart, too strong, too powerful, and overcame the humans. Right, and the last thing that I want to go over with you guys, well, I should say the second to the last thing, is characterization. Okay, characterization, we know, is the process by which the writer reveals the personality or appearance of a character. We call these character traits. So character traits can be what the character looks like, what the character says or thinks, how people feel about the character, how the character acts. Are they brave? Are they beautiful? Are they cowardly? Are they mean? Are they vindictive? These are all character traits that we use to describe what the character is like. The author will reveal these character traits to us by either saying it outright, yes, this character is very beautiful, or by describing the character in vivid detail. Okay, the character is tall with long flowing black hair that shines in the sun. Character didn't say outright, yes, I'm very beautiful, but by the description that the author portrays, we know that the character is being given the character trait of beauty. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is the components of plot, our story structure. So if we remember from last year, plot has 5 basic parts: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. So all of these things that we just mentioned, the setting, the characters, their character traits, the conflicts, you will experience these and see them described as you move through the different parts of plot. So in the exposition, that's the very beginning of the story. It's the situation before all the action starts. And this is where you will meet your characters, you'll meet your protagonist, you'll probably meet the antagonist. You'll learn the setting of the story and what situation the characters are in. You'll learn some of the character traits, not all of them yet, but just the basic elements of the story will be laid out in the exposition. As the story continues, you're going to hit the rising action. This is where a conflict is revealed to the reader and a crisis occurs that will ultimately lead to the climax. So in the rising action, you're going to start to learn the types of conflict. Again, returning to incantation, in the rising action, we learned that Estrella was Jewish and that she had this conflict of trying to decide whether or not to reveal herself, which would be a character versus self conflict. And of course, we have the conflict of the Jews being persecuted, which could be a character versus society conflict. We learn about these in the rising action. When we move into the climax, this is the most intense moment of the story. Okay, this is where all the major action occurs. In incantation, our climax would be when the soldiers come and they raid the house, and Estrella and her grandmother have to run away because her brother and mother have been captured. Her grandfather has been put on trial. The main action and intensity is occurring right there. That would be the climax. The falling action is everything that happens after the climax. Okay, so this is just the moment right after the climax where the dust is starting to settle, but we haven't come to the ending yet. The ending is the resolution. This is the conclusion of the story. How is the conflict resolved? How are the different strings of the story tied together? That will be the resolution, the ending of the story. All right, so this was a couple of the different things that we needed to review from last year, some basic elements that are worth noting because we'll be seeing them again this year. The only other thing I wanted to go over with you guys was how we're going to annotate this year. Last year, we used text coding. So we used the exclamation point as a prediction and the plus sign as new information and all that stuff. This year, we're going to be doing something a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more advanced, because we're sort of past the babyish phase of using text coding. So just very quickly, every time we read a new story, you will get one of these sheets. If you're working remotely, you will get them electronically. If you are in the class in the hybrid model, I will print these out so you can write on them as you're reading. So the directions say, while you are reading, you will write annotations for things that you notice in the text. For each row, pick one literary term, conflict, or text connection from the list below. Then write down the page number and your comment about what you noticed. So you'll see that you have this chart here, and you have a bunch of different options for what you can text code about. So if you see an instance of characterization where character traits are being explained, or imagery, you learn the setting, or you identify the exposition or the climax in a story, these are all options. Same thing goes for conflict, if you see different conflicts in the story, or text connections, if you relate to the story, or if you see a connection between another story that you've already read. These are all things that you can choose from to annotate. So when you come down here, what you're going to do is you're first going to write the name of the story. So let's say we were annotating for Incantation. I would write Incantation by Alice Hoffman. All right, I'm going to put this part down here. All right. After I identify the name of the book, the author, I'm going to have several rows that I can annotate on. You'll see the first row is already filled out. On page 10, I saw an example of characterization, and then here's my comment about it. The narrator characterizes Raven as being beautiful because he describes her pretty black hair. So I've noticed characterization on page 10, and I've written a comment about how I know that it is an example of characterization. Let's say then on page 13, I see an example of, let's say I see an example of conflict of character versus character. So I'm going to write character versus character conflict. And then over here, I'm going to say that Estrella experienced character versus character conflict when her best friend insulted her running skills. And this was the part of the story where she was saying, oh, you can't run as fast as I can. I'm a better runner than you. I noticed that this is a character versus character conflict because she's verbally insulting her. I'm going to write down my comment. I'm going to write down the term that I've selected, and then, of course, the page number where it occurs. If you have a hard copy of the story, for those of us who are going to be in person, you will have a hard copy of the story. You'll either highlight it or underline it to go along with this annotation. If you have an electronic copy of the story, you will just electronically highlight it in Google Sheets. Okay, so that's how we're going to be annotating this year. We're going to be using this piece of paper with all these different options to choose from instead of text coding. And if you guys have any questions about this as we begin using this annotation sheet, of course, let me know. All right, so that's it for today. Just make sure you answer all the questions on this Edpuzzle, and we'll start applying these terms next week.